My name's Ed Fortune.
And my name's Joe Abercrombie. Hello. Hello.
And we're here today to talk to Joe.
Oh. Joe Abercrombie, everyone! I love him, he's my favourite.
So you have to do that third time now, just to see if we can get louder.
Do we have to do it again?
Yeah.
And mine it? No, we're not going to do it again.
That's fine then.
At the end, maybe.
So hello, Joe.
Hey! How are you doing?
So let's start with the most obvious and easy question.
Yes.
You have a new book.
I do. There it is, look.
How would you describe the new book to an elderly relative who doesn't know your work?
Well, I'd tempt them with the sex scenes, first of all. My elderly relatives being what they are, you know? That's universal, that appeal. I would describe it as a fantasy set in a world moving towards an industrial revolution. I'd say you're probably better off reading some of my other books first, or at least buying them. And come on, Aunt Gladys, I've sent you all of them. Why haven't you read any so far? I'd be a bit upset about that. But I'd describe it as an epic sweep of love and war, in which the world is turned upside down and vivid and arresting characters struggle to survive or to prosper in this strange new set of circumstances. And then I'd have a slice of Battenberg or whatever Auntie Gladys had out for me that day. Jelly cream was very popular at one time, I seem to remember.
So it's structured as a series of point of views from various characters.
It is structured as points of view. It's kind of point of view writing, which is what I've always tended to do with these books, certainly. Trying to put the reader in the heads of the characters as much as possible and kind of trying to develop a different style for each character that is distinctive and kind of arresting and gets across a sense of their voice. So it's chiefly a central cast of 7. Well, there are 4, really, 4 main ones, 3 secondary ones, and then a galaxy of little people also having their moment in the sun, a brief flicker of the candle before it is horribly crushed by the ruthless author.
So, the previous book, you kind of broke some of those characters. Why are you so terribly cruel to them all?
I mean, I'm not, I just tell you about it, right? It's my job to just report on the facts. I see myself as a journalist, really. Certainly not cruel. People have got to know about what happened, and I'm there to tell you. But, you know, happiness and pleasant things are great when they happen to you, but they're not terribly exciting to read about. It's not the stuff of drama, is it? You want people to be damaged and in danger and changed by profound and difficult circumstances. I mean, that's what drama is. You want people to be kind of faced off against each other, not just happily getting on all the time. So, you know, happiness is a nice end point for a story, but it's not really a start point. It's not the engine, a drama. You want people to feel scared for the characters. You want them to feel they hate the characters a little bit sometimes, you know. So you want conflict and danger. Certainly I do when I read, and that's why I try to put it in when I write as well. So,
set in the First Law universe, this is now like a version of the Industrial Revolution. What made you decide to run this series like further along in history? What was the appeal of the Industrial Revolution? Why have you put various characters through that?
I think I've always been kind of interested in change. You know, a lot of the fantasy that I read as a kid was kind of set in these medieval sandboxes that felt like they'd never really changed very much, and conflict was just a case of, you know, an abstract good against evil, rather than in our world where conflict kind of boils up out of these big tectonic forces of social change and economics and competition for resources and competing political systems. I wanted the world to feel like it was sort of boiling over with change and with kind of powerful disruption. And so the First Law, you know, is kind of set in a period of the rise of merchants, I suppose. Rough analogue to the kind of mercantilism in Europe. So money's becoming more and more important and powerful and supplanting this kind of traditional aristocratic power. And then the natural next step felt like the Industrial Revolution. You know, that was the big change that happened in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And it just felt like a really interesting period to tackle, partly because, you know, I'm not sure fantasy often treads that ground. You know, you have steampunk, which always strikes me as a bit more of an aesthetic than anything else. It's kind of put some cogwheels and goggles on stuff, which is nice. Everyone likes a pith helmet. But still, it doesn't feel like a kind of an analysis of the Industrial Revolution so much. And I suppose there's just a lot of drama inherent in that time. You know, there's a sort of rich against poor, emerging money against sort of forces of stasis, rural against urban. And there's just naturally a lot of turmoil and upheaval going on, which makes for great drama, and different characters in different parts of society can kind of shed light on the very different states that different parts of society are in. So it just felt interesting and exciting, and the natural next step, I guess.
You're a great fan of history, and you're quite well read in history. What works did you draw on? What points of history did you draw on to produce this series, and specifically The Wisdom of Crowds?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been a sort of keen reader of history, though not a comprehensive one by any means. I don't suppose anyone can be. You kind of take interest in different periods at different times. So for this, I sort of read a lot of stuff, you know, kind of more technical things about how the Industrial Revolution happened, you know, how the way that the steel industry developed, which influenced how the coal industry developed, which influenced how the steel industry developed, and there was this kind of righteous cycle of advancement and change, which very rapidly led to big social change as people sort of moved from the countries into the towns for work, and a lot of the luxuries and things that had been for the very few, you know, like crockery or books, were kind of real luxuries that very few people could enjoy. Suddenly there were all kinds of people who were, you know, able to access those things. And although we think of the orphans down chimneys and the kind of unbridled capitalism and the sort of negative aspects of it, there was also this vast increase in the quality of life, because the rural poverty prior to that had been appalling, you know. So there was kind of a lot of downside to it, but a lot of upside. And so I read a lot of things like that, like Engels' Condition of the Working Class in Britain, you know, the sort of cornerstone of Marx and Engels' first experiments with communism, I suppose, where he's describing what the texture of life was like in the slums in the kind of 18th century. A lot of stuff about, you know, we think of steam power and we think of big smokestacks and the pollution of the Industrial Revolution, but there's a long period before that where it was mostly water power before steam power. So water wheels and mills alongside the kind of streams and rivers, a lot of them in the northwest and northeast of Britain. And so that early period of the Industrial Revolution was kind of fascinating to me. And I read about things like the Lunar Society, you know, which were this group of kind of gentlemen, experimenters and scientists and thinkers really, who were, you know, involved in a righteous exchange of ideas with money people and innovators, and were involved in the way that the whole thing behind the scenes was powered and moving forward. So there's a kind of whole range of stuff I was interested in, and obviously a lot of things I came upon as I was reading that were kind of useful to steal. Because my thing is I have very few ideas of my own, but I'm quite good at stealing other people's. And why would you come up with a new idea? There's so much work and risk involved in new ideas, but great ideas that have been used effectively already are like a winner, aren't they? So that's the way to go, I find.
So touching on themes for your work, what is it about an aristocracy? Because you keep coming back to aristocratic. I can't even say the word. Never mind do the joke. You keep coming back to aristocratic families, and I mean your work's been described as grimdark. And is there an inherent thing between, you know, the kind of aristocratic system that tends towards grimness, or is that a separate thing?
Well, I suppose fantasy's always obsessed with royalty and nobility. A lot of classic fantasy is all about, you know, people who, if they're not kings or nobles to begin with, end up kings or nobles by the end, or, you know, have a destiny to be extremely important. And, you know, those monarchic systems, I suppose, that, you know, put someone arbitrarily in charge in a way, haven't always been that positive to live under. I mean, what system is? That's part of the joke, I suppose, and part of the thing about these books is, you know, as Winston Churchill says, you know, democracy is the worst system of government apart from all the others that have been tried. You know, I suppose the problem with the first law, the problem that's faced in this book is, you know, if you can, not a big spoiler, if you can topple a monarchy, what do you do then? Because righteousness and wonderfulness and equality don't necessarily simply sprout up from the ground once you've kicked the king out of his throne. There's still work to do. So, I suppose fantasy is always interested in royalty, and I'm interested in what fantasy is interested in, because I like working in that form, and I like playing around with the expectations and the kind of traditions that people have there. So nobles definitely interest me, and that form of government, the wastefulness and corruption of it. But I'm also interested in people at the other end of the scale and how they relate to the people at the top. Interested in looking at the whole length of the ladder, and that was part of the approach with these books, was to kind of pick people scattered around in different places, some very much at the top, others at the bottom, and then to see what happens when they're forced to trade places.
You've talked about the cast of little people in your books, and there is this kind of there's always little people there that are as interesting. Have you ever found yourself during the edit having to rework those or reworking elements of those because they're too interesting? Or is there a thing that keeps a little character little?
I often read my book and think, this is too interesting. We need to dial this back, because, I'm really going to be putting other authors so much in the shade, they'll hate me, it'll be unpleasant. I need to really dial this back so that I can be more popular at author parties and so forth. I'm always trying to make things as kind of interesting and vivid as I can. I think you do sometimes hit upon people that work very well in a kind of small burst. And obviously these books have these little mosaic sequences with these extras, really, I suppose is what you'd call them. Little people who are very much tangential to the plot, but they get caught up in the events in one way or another. And I find those sequences are a really good way to describe the scale of a big event, and really look at some perspectives on it you might otherwise not see. And some really come to life very nicely. Others you have to work out harder to try and make them interesting. But in a way, I find those sequences quite easy because there's not a lot riding on them. You can kind of have a person who's got one little thing, one motif that makes them work. And that'll work for a couple of pages. It might not power a proper, well-worked character arc like some of the central points of view have to sustain. And so it's easy to just dip in and out of these minor vivid characters, and ideally they work as well as you possibly can.
So Heroes is essentially just one big epic battle, and you tend to put lots of epic scenes into your work. Did Heroes change the way that you planned and created epic scenes, or was it a culmination of what you'd learned at that point?
I suppose it was a culmination, but the Heroes is interesting, or was interesting for me, because it's all set in one place and one time. So a lot of epic fantasy is epic. It sprawls across continents and it takes place over years and involves huge casts. And the Heroes was one battle in one place, all over 3 days. And so everyone is within sight of each other, even if they're not necessarily together. And so they're easily influenced by things that happen elsewhere. And that was the first time I kind of hit on that idea of doing these sequences with extras. And it seemed to work particularly well for that setting, because it was a way to sort of follow the flow of a battle without stepping out of the personal involvement in it, if you know what I mean. I've always been much more interested in trying to get across the experience of being in the action rather than some kind of technical description of the action. So you might have a general who's looking down and trying to take an overall view of things, but I'm more interested in the individual people caught up in something. And so it just worked very well, that approach for that particular book. And it's something that worked so well, I felt I kind of had to continue to use it again, and albeit in slightly different ways in other books. And it just seemed to work nicely for these two, so I've kind of brought it back. Like I say, once you've used an idea once, why not keep using it?
So, touching on the consequences of massive battles, why do you keep chopping off bits of your characters?
I suppose this is what happens in a collision with edge weaponry. I would say again, I'm not chopping them off, I'm just telling you about the bits that got chopped off. But I suppose a lot of the fantasy I read growing up still features these battles with edge weapons, swung in anger at close range. It's kind of surprising people don't get bits chopped off rather than that they do. I would expect veterans of close quarters edge weapon fighting to have some pieces missing. And so that seems to be entirely fitting and right to me. And I've always been kind of interested in the consequences of violence and the consequences of things generally. In a lot of fantasy, people can have their wounds healed. They come away from their scrapes and their ordeals physically and emotionally kind of whole in the end. And that doesn't always happen in real life. People come away, even if they're whole before, which they're often not, they come away damaged in one way or another. And so, Glockner and Logan in the first law are both studies in violent men who've been sort of one way or another destroyed by their own violence or by the violence they've experienced. And I've always found that kind of interesting. What happens when you've got to pick the pieces up after the big battle's over and, you've got to make some kind of life. That's always interested me.
So one of the features of fantasy is kings. The other feature, of course, is magic. And your approach to magic is very much human-fronted in regards to that. Would you do it any other way? Or, do you think magic makes fantasy? Do you have to have magic to make it fantasy? Or do you think you can just, get rid of it altogether? What, for you, is the central interest in conflict?
Well, I suppose I've always been much more on the side of less magic than more. I like a world where magic's sort of rare and special and feels like something that comes to most people as surprising and horrifying and a bit unknowable. That's sort of my instinctive approach to it. That said, there's no reason you can't do it 1,000 other ways. That's just what has worked for me and for this series. The other series that I wrote, The Shattered Sea, there is kind of no magic. There's only sort of old technology, which is interpreted as magic. And in these books, magic is gradually drifting out of the world, which is kind of a bit of a classic trope of fantasy, generally speaking. And so whenever something's a classic trope, I try and steal it as much as I can and comment upon it is the way that I would put that, of course. So it's a world where magic is disappearing and is rare. And so it's kind of formed a less and less central part of the books as they've gone on in a way. And in this, although there are some magi in the background, they're more in the role of power brokers and manipulators than they are magicians necessarily. And obviously, there's a character who can see the future to some degree. She's got the long eye, but it's a bit of a weird and unpredictable and not terribly specifically useful power. So I like things that are a bit weird, a bit unknowable. I'm not so much a fan of, magic systems, as it were, or at least that's not what I'm drawn to as a writer. I find magic's most interesting when it feels magical, rather than when it becomes another kind of science or another system. So yeah, that's generally my approach. Keep it light on the magic where possible. But I suppose I've been toying with where the First Lord world might go after this. And one obvious place is to kind of bring magic back in a rush and open the gates again to a more modern and sort of developed world and see how that collision plays out. So you never know. Maybe there'll be loads of magic in future.
Would you be very kind to do us a reading of the new book, please?
I would do your reading. Yes.
Thank you.
So this is one of those little people sequences we were talking about. Doesn't really need a lot of explanation, I don't think. You'll pick it up, hopefully. "They're here," whispered Gray. Captain Leeb drew his sword. It felt like the right thing to do. "I am aware, Corporal." He tried to project an air of confidence. Confidence defines an officer. He remembered his brother telling him so. "I can hear them." Judging by the noise, there was a considerable number of them. A considerable number, and steadily approaching. It put Leeb in mind of the crowd's clamour at the contest. Hundreds of voices raised in delighted excitement. Thousands of voices. But there was a definite edge of madness to it, a touch of fury, an occasional punctuation of shattering glass, splintering wood. Leeb would have very much liked to run away. He didn't want anyone's blood on his hands, especially not his own. And he wasn't without sympathy for their cause up to a point. Freedom, and justice and so on. Who doesn't like that stuff in principle? But he had sworn an oath to the king, not to the king directly, of course, but he'd sworn it, even so. He'd been happy to swear it when things were going well, and supposed he couldn't just unswear it the moment things turned dicey. What kind of an oath would it be then? His colonel had assured him help was coming. From the King's Own, then from Westport, then from Starrickland, from ever less likely directions, but no help appeared to have arrived at all. Lieb glanced at his men, spread out across the width of the sparway. What a flimsy little red line they looked. Perhaps 40 flatbowmen, 80 spearmen, half of his company hadn't come out, somewhat looser in their oaths than he was. He'd always thought there was no more admirable quality than being a man of your word. Loyalty defines an officer. His father had often told him so, but it was starting to look as if a certain elasticity could be a useful thing. "They're here," whispered Grey again. "I am aware, Corporal." Lieb's mouth turned very dry as the murk from the foundry down the street was thinned out by the breeze. "I can see them. More of them, indeed, and more. Many look like ordinary citizens, women and children among them, brandishing chair legs and hammers and knives and spears made from mops. Others look like professionals, armor and bright weapons glinting as the sun peeped through. Lieb's jaw slowly dropped as he began to appreciate the sheer number of them. Plainly, the closed council's increasingly shrill proclamations, curfews, threats, examples had not had the desired effect. Quite the reverse. "By the fates," someone muttered. "Steady," said Lieb, but it came out a squeak that couldn't have steadied anyone. It might have unsteadied those already steady. Indeed, it was painfully obvious that his brittle little line had no chance of stopping that tide. No chance at all. When they saw Lieb and his soldiers, they wobbled to a halt, bunching up uncertainly, chants and cheers dying on their lips. There was an intensely awkward silence, and an inappropriate memory floated up from the depths of Lieb's mind. The intensely awkward silence after he, drunk, had tried to kiss his cousin Cytherin at that dance, and she jerked away in horror, so he ended up sort of kissing her ear. This silence was like that one, but a great deal more terrifying. What to do? By the fates, what to do? Let them through? Join them? Fight them? Run? And never stop? There were no good ideas. Lieb's lower lip twitched stupidly, but no sound emerged. Even a least bad idea was beyond him. Decisiveness defines an officer, but he hadn't been trained for this. They don't train you for the world suddenly coming unraveled. And now a rider pushed through to the front of the throng, a woman with a tangle of damp red hair and a furious sneer. It was as if her rage was an infection spreading instantly through the crowd. Faces twisted, weapons lifted, screams and cries and taunts burst forth. And suddenly Lieb had no choice at all. "Raise bows!" he spluttered, almost as if, running out of time to think of a better idea, he was left only with this self-evidently terrible one. His men glanced at each other, stirred uncomfortably. "Raise bows!" roared Corporal Grey, veins bulging from his thick neck. At the same time, he looked at Lieb with a vaguely desperate expression, the pilot of a foundering vessel, perhaps, looking to his captain, silently asking if they really did intend to go down with the ship. Perhaps that's why captains do go down with their ships. No better ideas. "Shoot!" squeaked Lieb, chopping downwards with his sword. He wasn't sure how many actually shot. Less than half. Afraid to shoot at so many? Unwilling to shoot at men who might have been their fathers, brothers, sons, women who might have been their mothers, sisters, daughters. A couple shot high, on purpose or in haste. There was a scream. Did 2 or 3 fall in the front rank of that seething mob? It made not the slightest difference. How could it? The terrifying she-devil at the front stabbed towards Lieb with a clawing finger, Kill those fuckers! And they charged in their hundreds. And you can read the rest later when you purchase the book at any good bookstore or bad one. Thank you. Thanks. I'll be here all week. Try the veal.
So we come to that part of the evening where we get to ask the crowd, go for wisdom of crowds, in fact.
It's my favourite. It's my favourite bit.
Members of the audience, if you can stick your hand up, and there's also going to be some questions going on online as well. If you have a comment or a statement, can you leave that to the very end?
Or a correction or a criticism. I'm not that interested in many ways.
Leave that to the very end. Questions only, please, if you don't mind. And we do have people with microphones wandering around, and please don't be shy. Otherwise, I will just continue to ask Joe ridiculous questions until he explodes.
I'm sure there'll be somebody who's got a question. Look there, him, everyone.
There'll be someone coming with a microphone.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. Hi, Joe. Amazing books.
Thank you so much. These ones, you mean? My ones?
All of them.
Oh,
all of yours.
Yes, good.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
So, apart from being amazingly entertaining and hilarious,
Yeah.
Stop battering him.
Oh, it's going to continue. Beyond that, I've also found your books to give a good frame for understanding history, politics, also psychology for understanding what it is to be a human, or even an idea of what that can be, that can give more truth and even a more healthy outlook on that. I mean, stop me if I'm going mad.
No, I won't stop you by being nice about me. Never.
So, I guess my question is, beyond the entertainment, do you consider the sort of truth and helpfulness that your books may bring, or is that incidental? Yeah, to put it into a question, is that mad, or am I making sense?
Well, I mean, you're very complimentary, so obviously that's fine with me. I think, to me, you start out to be entertaining, and you start out focusing on the characters and on the people, and hopefully the broader points are what happen when you try to do that in an honest way, and you set them on a course in a world that's kind of shifting and changing, and the themes, if you like, the deeper truths to which we as writers are all aspiring, my dear, they just sort of emerge as you're going. I suppose they partly mirror what's going on in the world around you. But, talking about psychology, I did a psychology degree. One thing that I studied particularly was failure. Human error was sort of my main area. And I guess fantasy stories and stories in general are often the stories of success and of, snatching a glorious triumph from the jaws of defeat. Whereas real life, and warfare especially, is often the story of failure and mistakes and misapprehensions and weird wrinkles of personality that have these profound effects, vain generals or generals who hate each other. Charge of the Light Brigade was caused by a kind of bizarre interaction of a set of generals who all happen to despise each other in a very particular way. And so I've always been fascinated by things that fail and things that go wrong and how people fail and why they do and why systems as a whole kind of fail, and the confluence of different factors that make that happen. And so I suppose I've always tried to reflect that in my books and to think about things that go wrong. And that perhaps, I don't know if that feels more truthful than the alternative, but it sits on the other side of the scales, And people often say that my books feel quite misanthropic or grim or unpleasant. I don't tend to see it that way because I often see it as a kind of comment on, a genre that traditionally has been quite optimistic and heroic. And so it's supposed to just say, here's another possibility. This is what the world can be like. This is what people can be like. And I try to just honestly get in people's heads and see how they would really think and feel. That's what I try to do. So I suppose if there's anything truthful there, it just kind of flows from that, really, more than anything.
We have a question from online.
Yeah.
You turn me. Oh, there we go. Turn me on. Oh, that seems wrong. Hello, online viewers. We have many questions from online, so I think the floor is going to have to pick it up. So Hala Williams is asking, Joe, you have a flair for battles.
Why, thanks.
Yeah. What do you think is important in a battle scene?
Funnily enough, much the same as I was just talking about just now, in the sense that I think what makes a battle scene interesting is sticking to the perspective that you've chosen, or the set of perspectives. It's being with the people who are involved in the battle, not so much being above it and thinking about the technicalities of what's going on. It's important to keep that stuff straight up to a point, but it's much more important to get the emotional side of it right and to convey the sense of being there and to give each person a kind of different take on it, a different experience of it that reflects who they are, So if you have an untried boy who's never been in a battle before, his way of looking at it will be very different to an experienced general who's looking down on things, or a hard-bitten sergeant who's been around the block 100 times, or a civilian who's kind of caught up in the midst of things and doesn't know what the hell's going on. So you're trying to get a range of viewpoints on something, and each one to be as vivid and specific and to feel like that person and their experience as you possibly can, I guess.
Question over in the chap with his hand up with the blue mask and the lack of hair.
It's very rude to talk of people's lack of hair. I don't know, that one for some reason upsets me. Although I, of course, have an entirely full shock of glorious dark locks that cover my entire head. Thanks for asking.
So you've mentioned taking inspiration from history a lot when you're looking at your work. One character in particular stuck out for me just in the first couple of chapters of this book. The former superior of Valbeck, I think it's Risenu, or am I mispronouncing it?
Risenu, I guess I say.
Am I right in thinking he's inspired by a combination of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Robespierre? Because the amount you mentioned of putting out endless amounts of speeches, papers, and then huge crowds being riled up to murder people just reminded me a lot of the French Revolution. And am I right in thinking you like to take kind of a broader, trying to think the right way of saying it, a kind of a broad approach when you're looking at different historical time points, looking at all these historical figures and drawing out what is more interesting to you? I'm just rambling now, sorry.
Yeah. No, I mean, of course there are kind of big figures in history, and this book particularly very influenced by the French Revolution, and so those people like Robespierre and others, there's loads of kind of big, bombastic figures of one kind or another there. I mean, I suppose I try not to, or I'm not tempted generally to do sort of very close transpositions of a real person into the fictional world, but certainly pick up on certain patterns and certain ideas, and I suppose Risenu is a sort of distillation of the social theorist, the great thinker who, doesn't necessarily have a lot really to offer when it comes to practicalities, so he was just a kind of distillation of a whole set of different figures and ideas, and also to a degree politicians in general. There's that tone, and I mean, when you read this book, obviously not wanting to give anything away, but Risenu kind of in a sense takes charge, and that's one phase of the sort of revolution with predictably appalling results. They're not necessarily more appalling than any of the other various systems of government that they try. So, I mean, he wasn't supposed to be any one particular person. There are other... Sorry.
I was just going to say, he struck me as like a hybrid of multiple different ideas in that field. Just right, just kind of found it very interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, Judge the same. Judge is supposed to be the sort of the yang to his yin, if you like. She's the fury and the id, if you like. He's the ridiculous superego. She's the dangerous id. So I suppose... they're two extremes, really, of the sort of the revolutionary spirit, I guess.
Can we take another question from online?
We can. We've got a nice one that fits in with what we're currently talking about. So Wild Dogs, hi Wild Dogs, is saying he's a massive fan. They are a massive fan of your work. In particular, the most flawed characters. Is there a character you see yourself in?
Well, I mean, the bizarre thing about being a writer is that all the characters are you, aren't they? Which is kind of weird. Very weird, actually. Because, when they have conversations, that is really me talking to me. As they say, is the first sign of madness. I mean, I suppose, you have ideas about what characters are going to be, and then you start writing them, and if you're lucky, they take on a sort of life of their own in a way. You get an instinctive idea of what they would say and what they wouldn't, of how they express themselves, and you try and, sculpt all their dialogue into something that is suitable to them and is sort of said in their voice. But exactly where those voices come from, it's a bit of a magic box often. But, they all have elements of me in them. So, I have the fantastic chin of Jezal, the fighting skills of Logan, the intensity and cunning of Savine. Something like that. I've run out of things to say on that particular one. But, I mean, yeah, they all have ideas. So, like, Koska's is kind of, his sense of humour is not entirely different to mine, but then it's not entirely the same either. So they're all sort of different ideas. And a lot of them are drawn from the things you sort of don't say in conversation, but slightly think. So, Glock's internal monologue, I mean, everyone's got a bit of that internal monologue going on. Tell me that you have. That's not just me, is it? You've often got withering things that come into your head that, you don't say. Even Jezal, the way he thinks about people, that's a kind of exaggerated, strain in my own thinking. So they're all sort of based on things you think yourself and extrapolate. In the same way as, when you're writing from the point of view of a soldier waiting to meet a charge, you think about what it felt like when a bunch of kids tried to kick your head in the pub one time, and then extrapolate. So you sort of build on those experiences you have had. I got quite wet once when I was climbing a hill. And so, that informs, obviously, the titanic struggles people have to climb a mountain or something. You just exaggerate and extrapolate, and you draw on those bits that are kind of, hopefully, that gives you some little grain of authenticity that makes things feel as real as they can.
And you've been waiting very patiently.
I'll stand up so I'm not just a voice in the dark.
Lovely.
Welcome back to our sanctuary during these plague times.
Oh, lovely to be here and facing the eyes of the readers once again, looking in the eyes.
Atypically, a trilogy is normally written a book at a time, but I believe that the first drafts of all three were written, and then you went back to do the second draft individually prior to publication, which means that the whole of the trilogy was plotted out quite some time in advance. And it features a blustering, bumbling people-pleaser, paralyzed by indecision, facing questions of the dissolution of the Union and secession from the Union. And I was wondering, how much of this is coincidence? How much was revised as you went along? And how much of our present are you actually responsible for?
Well, I mean, all resemblance to people living or dead is entirely coincidental, obviously. And as I was saying, I don't like to necessarily transpose people directly. But, even if we're writing about the past, we're all, as writers, living in the now, and everyone as readers is experiencing things through the lens of the now, So it's pointless not to pretend you're not influenced and you're not commenting on what's going on in the world. I mean, it's called the Age of Madness, and I feel like we've been living through our own little age of madness in one way or another for the last few years, with what's been going on politically on both sides of the pond, and more widely than that, it feels like a turbulent and kind of strange time, and that sort of strikes parallels in, admittedly much less bloody or kind of insane parallels, but with the French Revolution and with the Russian Revolution and with the Industrial Revolution in a way. I mean, going back to what you're saying about how they were written, the idea was always to write all three first. When I wrote the first Lord, just simply because of the way the publishing of it worked, it took me 6 months to find a publisher once I finished the first book. And it was a year and a half between finding a publisher and getting the first book published. And by that time, I'd more or less finished the third book. So I kind of had the luxury of revising and working on the whole thing together. And I felt like I had to do that again, really. You know, I couldn't put one book out and then get halfway through the second and think, oh no, I've gone the wrong way with this character, or I should have started in a different place, or I should have done a different thing, or set this up. So I felt like I had to get to the end to know what the start should be. And so drafting it all the way through was kind of always, you know, an important part of the plan. And I think I finished it in about 2018, mid-2018, finished the first draft. And then it's obviously been quite a long road of sort of revision and editing of, you know, steadily decreasing returns, as all things in life are. But definitely the result of that was that I weirdly seemed to have anticipated various events. Perhaps it's just that events are always happening somewhere, and so, you know, when you write something, events will naturally come up that seem similar. But for instance, I've done a whole thing about statue toppling in this book, and obviously then the whole thing with Colston in Bristol happened, you know, and the statues being toppled there, and the whole, you know, palaver over war memorials and statues and the whole thing that followed. And suddenly what I'd written just seemed like incredibly on the nose, and obviously written about that. I mean, worse still, it was written from the point of view of someone, you know, very much in step with the old regime, who was sort of taking a stance of, oh, the wondrous figures of the past lying in the dust, you know. And it seemed a bit like, oh, that's probably not the best angle to take on this. But not only that, it felt as though I'd taken a bit of a one-dimensional approach to it. And actually, it happening in real life and listening to all the various opinions about it, you know, and the different takes on it, made me think, yeah, maybe I could take a bit more of a multi-layered and interesting approach to that subject matter. So that led to me rethinking it a little, and also, you know, funnily enough, there's obviously a lot of riots, as you were just experiencing when I was reading there. A lot of riots and uprisings and things, and then shortly after that, the Black Lives Matter riots happened, and I thought, oh, when people read this, they'll think I'm talking about that. I need to be careful. And then, of course, Trump's riot in the Capitol happened. I thought, oh, now people think I'm talking about that. I need to be careful. And so it made me kind of a bit more careful about exactly how I was pitching it, and making sure I was trying to take a few different angles on everything and hopefully present a multi-layered and honest appraisal, you know, rather than taking too much one side or another. So it was interesting. I was almost rewriting it according to current events. You know, current events were causing me to reinterpret it a little rather than inspiring it in the first place, perhaps.
Given your prescience, I'm really tempted to ask you about lottery ticket numbers. But moving on, can we get another question from online, please?
We can. Kate Anderson would like to know, did you ever really, really like a character, and then you felt bad about the horrible things you wrote happening to them, even though it was important to the story?
No, in both cases. I like the characters, but I like them, I mean, in quite a weird way. They're not people. You know, hopefully to the reader, they feel like people, but they don't really feel like people to me in quite that way. I mean, they have no agency without me, right? They can't do anything I don't want them to do. This is, again, starting to sound a bit weird. But I suppose I like a good character in the way that a joiner likes a good screwdriver, right? They're useful, they're effective, they help me get the job done. But they're there to do a job. And, you know, if you have to snap the screwdriver when you're trying to jimmy something, it's all part of life. You know, it has to be done. And, you know, when you, as a reader, read something shocking or nasty, you know, hopefully it comes at you out of the blue, it's surprising, it has a sort of an effective instancy, like if you experience it in the street, you know. But as a writer, that's not how it works at all. You know, you've usually planned it sometime in advance. You've thought about how a sequence is going to develop, where it fits into the larger movements of the story. And then you've drafted it over time, over a few days, and then you've rewritten it, and then you've revised it over and over in different parts of revision. You've discussed it with an editor. You've thought about exactly how to make it most effective. So it's a kind of becomes a long game, a watchmaker's approach to it, really. And so you don't have that feeling of, you know, feeling bad for the character. because usually it's about trying to pay off something that's long planned and trying to get the most effect out of it that you can. And that's what they're there for. You know, that's what the characters are there for. They're there to get a response from the reader, and if they achieve that, then brilliant. You know, horrible things happening to characters is necessary if you're going to feel that it's real and that it's dangerous, you know. And so good things happening aren't worth a lot unless you think horrible things can happen. You know, you've got to have both in order for it to have impact, I feel.
Oh, could we get another question from the floor, please? Middle. There we go.
I've got a question broadly about the world building, but it may ramble off in some other direction. We'll find out. It's I've just the world building in the first Lord of the Swords. It stands apart from a lot of the fantasy map. It's very kind of natural. Like there's not any big glossaries. There's not a lot of maps. It's all sort of, it's built up through little details. Like there's sayings like "by the dead," "back to the mud" in the north, and it's all kind of little cultural details. And I'm wondering just kind of, firstly, how much of that was planned out going into it initially, and how much, like for instance, kind of there's references to Styria in the original trilogy. How much were you planning to expand on that, and particularly with characters as well, like Koska and Gorst? Did when you wrote that originally, were you planning to go back?
Yeah, I mean, in answer to the second part first, I wrote, obviously, these 3 big books, and that had always been the plan, to kind of write a big trilogy, my version, my take on Lord of the Rings, you know, and classic trilogies with the things I'd read, and so that's what I wanted to write. And it wasn't until I was kind of halfway through the 3rd book and my editor said to me, you know, "What are you going to do next?" I had this horrifying realization that, you know, that wasn't it. When you start a huge trilogy like that, you never think about getting past book 1, let alone book 3. It's a ridiculous thing to take on, really. And suddenly, I had to think of new ideas. And so, you know, I developed the 3 ideas for the standalones, really working out of the bits that were left over, in a way. To go back to the joiner metaphor, it was like, what can I make out of all these odds and sods that were left when I built the shelves, you know? And Styria was just a place that had been mentioned that felt like it was worthy of further study, and, you know, it was an Italianate kind of idea. Most of the cultures are sort of based on pretty obvious things, because I find, although that kind of world building is pretty obvious and people do it a lot, it has huge advantages in terms of you don't have to lay everything out for the reader. You can allude to a few things that sound a bit Italianate, and they'll fill in the blanks pretty effectively because they know what that kind of setting was like. You know, people immediately go to Machiavelli and warring city-states and mercenaries and that kind of stuff. So you can very quickly kind of establish world in that way. So I didn't have kind of plans to develop those characters, but it was partly also what seemed to work. So, you know, Koska was just, he was going to be a character based on Renaissance Italian mercenaries, condottieri. Sir John Hawkwood was one I was thinking of, famous mercenary general who fought for Florence. And he was just, you know, a character that I stuck in there, but he very quickly became quite an interesting character. And I thought he could still be interesting, you know. And then Styria, where he comes from, seemed to be an interesting place to set a story, so I started to develop what that story might be and what other characters might be pulled into it. You know, it was a case of who else was on the shelf, and Shivers was available, so I thought I'd stick him into the story as well. And Vitari, you know, I'll stick her in. Carlat Danida, she was left over, I could stick her in. So, you know, it's kind of using whatever was left. But in terms of that world building, I do like the low effort world building. You know, I try to avoid, my lord, well, as you know, it is 300 years since the battle was fought in the valley where your heroic forebear, Jangos IV, defeated the Dark Lord for the 3rd time. You know, you want to avoid that sort of chewy stuff if you can. And so I like, you know, the Union has kind of Germanic names. the aristocrats do. And so that gives you a kind of vague sense of Holy Roman Empire, a vague sense of kind of Germanic efficiency, of Prussian efficiency in the military, and you straight away produce a certain feel, you know. Likewise, the northern names and, as you say, the kind of cultural phrases and so on. That was just what kind of developed naturally as I was writing, and then certain of them seemed to strike a chord and to work, both in terms of the character. So, you know, Logan Ninefingers has his repeated phrases. I don't know if anyone's read the book, might have noticed he occasionally repeats these phrases. They were phrases that worked, and so they seemed to need repeating, you know. They summed up something about him. And likewise, you know, things like Back to the Mud or The Great Leveller, you know, they were just phrases that came up as I was writing, and then they seemed to sort of strike at something deeper about the culture, and that differentiates the people and their way of thinking. And that, to me, is what kind of good world building is. It's about the characters, as everything is about the characters. You know, it's about their experience of the world and the differences between them and the different ways they think and approach the world. That's what makes it interesting. So I'm always looking for that, to try and differentiate the characters, make them as vivid as possible, which means making their cultures as kind of vivid and interesting as possible. And I love when those things collide, you know, when characters step out of their familiar milieu to sort of enter something totally different and become fish out of water. So, you know, Logan visiting Adua and experiencing the culture that to Jezal is entirely normal, you know, is a totally crazy for him, and he doesn't know how to respond to it, and he seems a complete idiot in those settings, you know. So I'm always fascinated by the way that cultures kind of collide as well.
So, person in the yellow and black top that had a question from the floor. Gold and black. Do we have any more? Yes.
Do you have a writing routine, and how do you mature your stories?
Sorry, I missed the first bit.
Do you have a writing
Do you have
routine?
a writing routine, and how do you mature your stories? Are you more somebody writing everything in a row and then leaving it for a while, or are you writing every day and living alongside your characters?
Some routine, not a huge amount, less than I should, probably. I mean, partly projects go through different phases, you know, and so it's hard to have a routine that's sort of universally effective. So when you're starting out something new, you know, there's usually quite a lot of researching and reading and thinking and sort of just scribbling ideas down that goes on. And that's pretty formless. When you actually reach the main period of drafting and going through stuff, I try to exert a decent bit of discipline then. I usually aim for a certain number of words in a week, say. And, you know, that might start at maybe 5,000 in a week, because then I can feel good when I do 6,000. But then as I'm kind of, the project's getting into the middle and I feel like it's going well and I'm moving quickly, it might get up more. So in the case of these books, the first book took about 18 months to write, to get a draft of, which is quite a long time, but obviously there was a lot to think about and get right. And the second two took 6 months each, which is really fast for me. And at that time I was kind of writing 10, 15,000 words a week, which is really fast for me. Because I knew the characters and I knew what I was doing, and it was kind of quite easy to get the voices right and to just, you know, the machine was built and it was letting the wheels spin in a way. So that's when it becomes a bit easier. Then having written the whole draft, there's obviously this long process then of revision and rethinking, and that kind of, from a first draft to a second, is really where I'm thinking about the big questions of the character arcs and the plotting, other things that really don't work, are the things that need to be kind of elaborated on and developed a bit more. Do people need to be changed or rebalanced in the way they act or the way they are to make their kind of development more convincing or more believable or more intense? Do they need to start more one way so they can go more the other way? And often I'm discussing that with my editor as well, and she'll have some opinions on what works and what doesn't. That all goes into the figuring. And so the second draft I might be adding quite a few new scenes. In the case of this book, certainly, I rewrote the last part quite a lot because I suddenly realised there was a better way of kind of arranging it that brought all the characters together at the end, which was something that I really needed to do. and kind of mirrored the way they'd come together at the end of the first book. But with all this water under the bridge, it was quite a nice repetition of the motif. I like things that come full circle often, and so I rewrote the end of this book, quite thoroughly. And then having got a second draft, the hope is then that you've got something that is consistent and coherent throughout. You might have changed the names of some characters or maybe combined some minor characters together or cut some, things like that. And you apply that to everything, so you've got hopefully a coherent book. And then I've developed this process over time of kind of phases of revision that focus on different aspects of the book. So I'll start with character, basically. I'll go through revising and trying to cut down and get as much voice of the characters as possible. And with the secondary characters, trying to give all of their dialogue as much sense of their personality as I can, as much of their dialect as I can. So, some of the more important secondary characters will have a very decided way of speaking, will have developed quite a way of speaking. So Isn't-It-Fail, say, has a very specific dialect and way of speaking. So I try and apply that as much as possible and apply it to the way they behave and their actions, rather than having a neutral thing like someone pointing at something or smiling or nodding. Is there something specific and detailed that will tell me something about that person that is a bit more arresting? And then the next round is about the setting, where I'm looking at the same thing but from the point of view of the setting. I might write a conversation in quite a neutral way, in quite a neutral space, that barely feels like it's coherent, barely feels like it's doing much. And that might be suitable for some scenes, but often it's worth thinking about the weather, about the light, the time of day, the temperature, Where's it happening? What's interesting about the place? Can you give it one specific thing? So one example, the trouble with peace, there's a conversation that happens in a room. I thought I'll put a load of hunting trophies on the walls, and see what that does. And then it brought out certain ways of thinking in the person who was, narrating that scene. She observes the hunting trophies around, and when she's saying a certain thing, she thinks about the fox, or she thinks about the deer, or she's thinking about, it brings something extra to the scene and something else out of the characters. And then the final one is sort of just looking at the detail of the writing. And what I usually do is a very, very sophisticated and clever thing, which is I make the text really big. Very, very clever. Make the text really big. I've got a big screen, I make the text big. And then when I type, I feel very powerful because the letters are huge. But it also lets you kind of see the text in a bit of a different way, and you can focus in a bit more on the kind of individual phrases and sentences, and that's what I'm doing there, trying to get the rhythm as right as I can and to make it as short and to the point and effective as I can. So that's just looking at the language, and then it goes off to be copy edited generally. So that's kind of the phases it goes through. Sorry, long answer.
Long answer. I think we've got time for just one more question from online.
One more question.
We do, and I'm going to combine three. And it's a question that is probably also sitting in the room. So, next project. If you could write one of the following three, which one are we most likely to see from you? So, Valence Space suggested an extremely innocent children's book.
Yep.
Neil broadly suggested a Joe Abercrombie sci-fi. Or another Valence Space suggestion, which is my favorite, which is historical romance.
Oh, definitely historical.
Which of those three? Historical romance?
Definitely historical romance. I mean, I have written that already in many ways. I regard these books as kind of... there's a bit of bodice ripping in there, right? I mean, why not? Absolutely. Romance all a part of life. I'm happy to, do that job, if that's the job people need done by me, which probably isn't. I mean, the innocent children's book, I don't know. The children's literature is just too cutthroat for me. It's a brutal world, savage competition. I don't think I've got the guts for it, if I'm honest. Sci-fi, sci-fi I'll enjoy watching and I enjoy reading sometimes, but it doesn't actually... I have no personal passion for it in the way I always had for fantasy. I don't know why. It's just not really my thing so much. So I can't really see it, or at least if I did, it would be in a much softer style of sci-fi that really is just fantasy anyway. But the historical romance, yeah, man, for sure.
I'm still hoping beyond hope for Heroes the musical.
I don't see any reason why not. We're the Union, we've come to fight today. Yeah, I can see that, definitely.
You've got the right characters.
Yeah, I think it could work as a musical.
And I think on that note, thank you very much, Joe Abercrombie, for your time.
It's been a pleasure.
For answering all our questions. Not that we've had a chance to, we could go on for hours, I'm sure.
We could go on for hours.
But we'd get told off.
We would get told off.
So can I have a round of applause, please?
Thank you. And thanks to all of you for coming as well and braving the COVID world and coming out, because it's been a weird couple of years, right? And for the first book, I was touring as normal. Second book, nothing, lockdown, virtual events. So it's lovely to be back out in the real world and to look people in the eyes. And I hugely appreciate you coming out. It's lovely to see people again. Thanks.
It's really nice to see you as well, Joe.
Yes,
Thank you.
and a big thank you from me as Chimera Festival for all of you joining us. And thanks for our online viewers as well. It's lovely to have you on the screen. Just a couple of housekeeping things with the signing. So we're signing up there. And we're going to do it by rows just to keep you slightly more, isolated. So we're going to start with the first couple of rows, if you don't mind. So just remain seated, the rows beyond. And I'm sure Joe will be super quick.
Super quick.
Super quick. And no hugs. No hugs, sorry.
Borrowed that one earlier. What are we doing? I'm not still on.